There is no one better in the country to put in context what we've been discussing today, and also no one better in the country to remind us that we have jobs and we have responsibilities. And the latter, at certain times, must override the former. So Dale, great pleasure to be with you.
Because after 30 years of running up and down stairs in power plants, my knees don't work as good as they should. This up and give you the big picture. And hold on just a second. I will say this, I have not prepared any detailed presentation, and I didn't figure that I needed to, because I knew Dan had his mind wrapped completely around Andorra with the facts and figures about San Onofre. I was given the opportunity. Dan asked me to review the report before it was issued to the NRC, which I did. And I can only say I am incredibly impressed with the amount of work that these guys did. The incredible amount of data that Dora went through, Dan went through, and how they get their facts straight and present it very clearly as he's done here. I've known Dan for what, maybe almost 40 years. And starting from in 1976 when I left GE. And Dan has just kept on consistently going after this very serious problem that we face in this country and in the world. And I can only say that I appreciate the fact that there are people like Dan who are out there continuing to do this kind of work. I had retired about 7 or 8 years ago and figured I wasn't going to have to do anything more. And then Fukushima came along. When Fukushima came along, all of a sudden the phone started ringing and my name apparently had drifted to the top of the pile because of the work that I had done back in 1976 and later years with Mark I containments, as Dan has spoken. The thing that I wanted to talk about mostly is this issue of the regulatory problems. How do you get the regulatory authorities to do the real job that they are supposed to do? I hate to just talk about negative things, but there are not a whole lot of positive things to talk about. So I guess that's an apology, but that's the way it is. Back when I first started in the nuclear business a long time ago, about 50 years ago or so, in the United States, the nuclear programs were regulated by what was called at that time the Atomic Energy Commission. The Atomic Energy Commission had two jobs. One was to regulate safety, and the other one was to promote the use of nuclear power. You laugh, and of course that's the usual reaction, because how can you do both of these independently without without bias one way or the other? Now, when I was about in, let's see, I think it was about in 1970, 72, something like that, it became obvious that this was a problem. And so the U.S. government decided that they were going to separate regulation from promotion. So they left the Atomic Energy Commission as it existed, more or less, and they split off the regulatory authority into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The problem was, of course, they didn't change any people, they just moved people's titles and reporting chains of command. Now, when I was working at GE, I had, I'll say, the opportunity. I really enjoyed my work. And I did quite a bit of work with the Japanese utilities. I did some work on Fukushima. I did some work on Suruga in Japan and a couple of other plants. And in the early days back then, in about 1970, the Japanese regulatory authority fell under the auspices of an organization called MITI, M-I-T-I, and I don't remember what it stood for, but it was sort of like the NRC. And then it devolved into NISA, the Nuclear Safety Agency, and now just this year they have made another change. They have now split the regulatory authority in Japan off to another organization. But the problem, I'm sure, is going to be just like we had in this country, and that is, you got the same damn people doing the same thing. And it doesn't really change the way they do the work. It doesn't change their mindsets. As Dan indicated, I left GE back in 1976 because at that time I had been given a special assignment, which was to manage the reevaluation of the Mark I containment designs. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on it, but the problem was the system had not been designed to withstand the accident that it was supposed to contain. And we had some 16 plants already in operation in the United States, another 10 or so around the world when we became aware of that problem. Well, what would you do if you knew that you had, as Dan used the metaphor, you got the car without brakes going down the road? You either really slow down or you stop it. Well, of course, in the nuclear world, you don't do that. If you acknowledge that you have a serious safety problem, you run the risk of shutting the whole industry down and ruining your business opportunities. So, of course, the pressure was on to keep things running while we did about a 5-year analytical program to determine whether they were safe, weren't safe, were safe enough, needed to be modified, or what. And I'm going to just give you one little story that I remember about the 1st of January in 1976. I had arranged to go to a review meeting with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission back in Washington, D.C. And you know how most of the government meetings are, you have this rule that, you know, everything has to be done with transparency, you know, the Sunshine Act and so on. Well, when we showed up in Washington, we of course went out to dinner with the NRC the night before. We went back to their offices. We told the NRC people that we had some serious problems and that we needed to really seriously think about what to do with these plants that were in operation. In reply, we got from the main guy at NRC, who was responsible for reviewing this stuff, he gave us a 1-hour chalk talk on the blackboard explaining to us why this could not be a problem. Right? This was the regulatory authority. So that gives you a feeling for the mindset. Okay, now the thing that I would just say about Fukushima, I have a few facts. I Googled the Fukushima recovery plan this afternoon. I've been following it pretty closely for about a year, but things, the flow of information has sort of slowed down now. They're in the middle, you know, they're slogging along trying to figure out what to do with the thing. But there's some interesting things I can tell you about Fukushima. Fukushima Daiichi plant consists of 6 units, all of them in Mark I containments. TEPCO, the operator of the plant, has decided that they're not going to attempt return any of those plants to service. They can't, of course, because they're melted down, but they have decided that they're going to terminate operation of all 6 of those plants. 2 of them perhaps could have been put back in service. They have another plant, Dale E, which has got 4 more units, and they're considering not starting those up either. I just want to give you some numbers here. In 10 years of last year, a start should be made with the retrieval of melted fuel of the reactors. Okay, they're going to start to remove the melted fuel in 10 years. But before they do that, they have to repair the containments on all of those plants because there's so much radioactivity and so much stuff that they've got to deal with. They've got to make sure that the containment will in fact contain the cleanup operation. So, and then decommissioning would take more than 30 years because the pressure vessels of the reactor vessels are damaged and filled with melted fuel and so on. And then they go on to say that the overall cleanup program will take 30 years, perhaps, if they did their cost estimates properly, and it's going to cost them in the neighborhood of 405 billion yen. Okay, if you don't know what a yen is, it takes about 80 of them to make $1. So they're talking about 50 to 60 billion dollars to just clean up the mess. You know. Well, PG&E built Diablo Canyon for about $5 billion apiece. So what that really says is it would, to clean up the mess of Fukushima, will cost what it took to build 2 or 3 Diablo Canyons. So the bottom line is that nuclear power, as Dan says, as David Brower said, is a good way to find an earthquake fault. It's also a very expensive way to boil water. It is a very demanding and very difficult technology because just one little mistake can really, as they say, one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day. So that's about the extent of my comments. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, if you have anything. I guess I should say this. There are no Mark I containments in the state of California, so you don't have to worry about them here. There are no boiling water reactors west of Iowa, so there are no BWR containments that you have to worry about. Well, that's not quite right. There's one in Washington State, but I think the thing that we need to worry about here is also we need to take a look at Diablo Canyon from a seismic standpoint. So with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Containment, very simple. Well, it means, I guess it's very obvious, it means A, maybe it's not possible, or it's going to be extremely expensive. Now, I've read recently there's been some renewed discussion in Japan about the use of a sarcophagus approach to Fukushima. That, for those of you who have followed the Chernobyl accident, you know that that's what they did there. They basically buried it in concrete and lead and did not attempt to clean it up. And so there is a possibility that they may have to go that way in Japan at Fukushima. I get a report about every 2 weeks from Japan, and you know they're extremely technically detailed and complex, and I don't even try to read it all. But they talk about the migration of radioactive material into the into the ground strata, and how they're going to, how they're going to try to stabilize that to keep it from eventually going into the ocean. They have built a bunch of walls in the ocean, on the waterfront there, to try and keep the stuff from flowing out to the ocean, and they're probably going to have to do a lot more of that.
The figures that Dale gave you about the cost of cleaning up Fukushima is the cost of cleaning up Fukushima,
Right.
the reactor. The much larger question is, what do you do for the countryside that's been contaminated? And to put that in human terms just for one moment, the Japanese government about a year ago attempted to relax the radiation protection standards 100-fold because schoolyards were so radioactive that they would have to scrape off the topsoil or bar the kids from going out to the playground. And so they chose instead to relax the standard to a figure of 2 rem per year, which by their own estimates for young children would cause a cancer in every 100th kid. From just 1 year of going to school and playing in the playground. And I mean, I have some sympathy for the Japanese government. What do you do when a large part of your countryside is contaminated at levels that are normally considered unacceptable? But relaxing the standards seems to be a pretty poor approach. So what we're not yet talking about is what is the effect beyond the boundaries of the plant. In some senses, the Japanese got lucky because the wind blew a fair amount of the radioactivity out to the ocean. On the other hand, we've never had an accident in which that much radioactivity was dumped into an ocean. It was not just by airborne and falling down, but what Dale and I were dealing with day by day during the accident was because the reactors were failing, they were trying to use these pressure suppression pools as a way of trying to cool things down and reduce the pressures, and quickly that stuff boiled away. They had to dump this radioactively contaminated water into the ocean. They would bring in salt water in to spray into the cores and having that stuff go into the ocean. There were levels of radioactive cesium and strontium and iodine in the sea off of Fukushima that were millions of times permissible concentrations. Millions of times. And what that does, no one can really figure out. Yes, the ocean will dilute things, but sea life concentrates it. It works its way up the food chain. I have not seen any models that deal with what the long-term effects are of that much radioactivity going into an ocean. So, you know the old line, it's a lot easier, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's very hard to get it back in. Well, nothing is truer than radioactivity for that. And so, what you want to do is avoid getting it out. And it didn't happen. You should understand what the two of us were going through during those days. We heard they lost power, we heard they lost backup. We didn't quite know why they lost the backup, now we know, it got flooded. And then, I mean, you understand, there's someone who's been technically critical of nuclear power for years, there's something inside your soul that doesn't want to believe what you say yourself. It can't possibly be that bad. And I don't think either of us had ever contemplated a situation with 3 reactors, 4 spent fuel pools could be at risk. And then we watched while one reactor after another had hydrogen explosions. We'd always thought a hydrogen explosion was theoretically possible, something you kind of worried about, but we kind of worried about it on paper. And to see the actual footage of the explosion, and then to see another one, and another one. I mean, it wasn't, this was one quirk for one reactor, this was a fundamental design defect. And that is, in large measure, what Dale had been arguing about from the beginning. These containments, to save money, were small. They couldn't contain the accident. And we saw at Fukushima, the stuff went right out. And Dale is being very kind to California to say we have no BWRs, boiling water reactors, no Mark I containments. But he was also reminding me that boiling water reactors don't have steam generators. Because we have pressurized water reactors, we have steam generators, and that's what's failing at San Onofre.
Well, in fact, Dan, at GE, the party line was, we don't have to worry about steam generator failures because ours already failed 100%.
Yeah, right. We pre-failed our steam generators by not having them. Some acoustic devices to listen for vibration, and the problem was they weren't listening for the last year or two. during the period that the steam generators were tearing themselves apart, the acoustic sensors were detecting that, but the operators simply ignored it. This time they might not ignore it quite as readily. But that's not, look, what concerns me is not a one-tube breaking with a small amount coming out. What concerns me, there's certain kinds of accidents that you worry about with steam generators. Dale knows this vastly better than I, but you worry about a main steam line break. If the main steam line breaks, you reduce the pressure on the outside of these tubes, which essentially puts them under tremendous stress. And that stress, under certain circumstances, could cause them to burst. So if I have a main steam line break, I can propagate a whole bunch of tubes breaking. And the reason this is particularly nerve-wracking for San Onofre is that they had 8 tubes in Unit 3 that when they pressure tested to the kind of pressure they might get if there was a main steam line break, they burst. And they burst when they were 11 months old. And under normal circumstances, they wouldn't even gone in and checked to see how much wear there was for another year plus. So if the model's wrong, if they get a lot of wear between shutdowns, and something happens, you can have an accident. Look, I think both of us would say there's a pretty reasonable chance they can run for 5 months and nothing's going to happen. There's a reasonable chance they could start up and run for another 10 months and nothing would happen. But there's a non-negligible chance that something could happen. And you're gambling with an awful lot of people.
One thing that you did not mention, I don't think, in your presentation, is how many steam generator tubes there are in these plants. Each steam generator has about 10,000 tubes, and there are 2 steam generators in each unit. So there's 40,000 tubes.
A lot of places where something could go wrong. You also should know that the steam generators at San Onofre, to the best I've seen reported, I believe is correct, are the largest steam generators in the country, which is a part of the problem. They're trying to extract a massive amount of heat. And they had to do some innovations with the design.
Maybe my ring finger. And I think Dora said they're 4 100ths of an inch thick.
Well, that's what they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
There are thousands of them now that aren't. Because those figures I showed you are the wear. So they've lost 10%, 20%, 30% of the thickness. They're supposed to get plugged to 35%. But they're already like halfway there once they have them plugged. And that's pretty amazing. You know, your teeth, your adult teeth are supposed to last your life or close to your life. At a certain point, you begin to have a little bit of grinding down of them on those surfaces. Okay? Well, that's okay when you're in your 60s. You know, you've eaten a lot of meals. It's not supposed to happen within a few months of you getting that first set. And that's what's happened with these steam generators.